And class is in session. You're listening to Shit Shooting 101. I'm your host, Joshua Lee. Joining us today, author of Latitude 33, Key to the Kingdom, The Esoteric Napoleon, and The Empire of the Wheel series. An investigator of historical occult mysteries, he puts the in research, searching again and again for new perspectives, deeper insights, devilish details, and broadened horizons of knowledge. Here with a fine-tooth comb in his gun holster and some wild-ass speculation in his back pocket to decode the esoteric and reload the mind with the armament of curiosity and critical thinking, it's Walter Bosley. Walter, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, this is a great honor. It's going to be an awesome conversation. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm the type of host who doesn't like to beat around the bush, so let's get down to brass tacks. I'm willing to guess that most of my audience has never heard of the Sonora Aero Club. And so if you could give us a crash course in that, what was the Sonora Aero Club?
It's a very interesting story because some folks point out that it has generally for a long time been classified as just a fantasy created by what you would call an outsider artist. But as I've said elsewhere, you spend any amount of time looking into the Sonora Aero Club and Charles Dellschau, the gentleman in question, who is the first source of all this, you see that there's a lot more evidence, or enough evidence to suggest that it was a lot more than just the fantasy of some outsider artist. And essentially, Charles Dellschau was a German immigrant who claimed that in the 1850s he came to the United States from Germany, and that he came here under the auspices of this mysterious organization that he called NIMSA. And they were the sponsors, I guess you'd say, of these interesting little groups around, in this particular case, North America, that, according to Dellschau, were dabbling in various experiments with exotic technology, especially for the day. And the Sonora Aero Club very specifically dealt with flight. Now, this was the 1850s, of course, half a century before the Wright brothers and aeronautics as we know it. And allegedly, again, according to Dellschau's description, they were dabbling with, for lack of a better term, some type of what appeared to be anti-gravity technology in the 1850s. So from there, you can trace to the airship mystery of the 1890s, which more people are aware of course. I think a lot of people have heard about the airship mystery of 1896. I personally think that, again, that the story of the Sonora Aero Club is somehow connected to the 1890s airship mystery. And in my books and in my research, I kind of lay out all those threads. But that's essentially it. I would call it, really in a nutshell, for those who've never heard of Dellschau and the Sonora Aero Club, you could call them the prologue to the story of the 1890s airship mystery.
And these arrows, as he describes them, they look like they have balloons, but they're certainly not balloons, and they have a technology behind them that he describes. Would you mind explaining that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating from the perspective of folks like us that are interested in the lost technology of forgotten civilizations, as I like to put it. Many people have heard of Vimanas, the legendary and alleged flying machines of ancient India, or more specifically, of the civilization that preceded India, right? And there is supposedly this method of propulsion and lift and anti-gravity, again, for lack of a better term, that involves rotation. And rotations, of course, mean torsion and vortices, and also a chemical interaction, specifically this mercury vortex engine, which has in recent years, well, in the last century, been tied to the idea of the ancient Vimanas. Well, the Sonora Aero Club, when you look at Dellschau's drawings, see, that's the thing. That's why Dellschau's considered an artist, because he did hundreds of drawings of these flying machines, the Aeros, A-E-R-O. And when you look at the drawings and when you read his description on how these things were propelled, lifted, how, the engine, the motive power, it is essentially like the so-called mercury vortex engine. There was a chemical process. The fuel, more specifically, the secret formula, you might say, of the fuel, was created, according to Dellschau, by the leader of the Sonora Aero Club, a gentleman named Peter Menace. Now, what's interesting is it appears that, and I learned this through my research, it appears that he was using his secret fuel formula in a Rankine cycle turbine process. Now, Rankine was one of the founders of the study of thermodynamics, okay, in the early mid 19th century. And in 1849, he designed this turbine cycle engine, this process, okay? And he published it in 1851, a couple of years later. What's interesting is that by 1856, according to Dellschau and his writings and his drawings, Peter Menace was applying that exact process to these flying machines called Aeros. The only difference was the liquid, for the chemical reaction that he would use in this process was of his own design, his own blend recipe, and he never told anyone exactly what was in it. Now, here's what's interesting: is Dellschau died in 1923, so all these drawings and his journals and his story about the Sonora Aero Club, these were all done between some sources say 1898 and 1908. Others say as early as 1893. What's interesting is when you look at the schematics that Dellschau drew of this engine, this motor, this process, it is identical to the Rankine turbine cycle engine that was published in 1851. Now, you could say, well, Dellschau was a scholar of these mechanical engineering, and it'd be easy for him to have made it up by taking Rankine's schematic and coming up with this story. But you could just as easily argue that Peter Menace, being an engineering-minded guy himself, learned about and studied the Rankine cycle turbine. I always mess getting those up in the right order. I'm still doing it wrong probably. And found a way to apply it to his hypothesis of flight using this secret formula that he called the soup, by the way. It was green, and when he died, the secret allegedly died with him. And he allegedly died, according to Dellschau's reports, in a flight test in which there was an explosion and a fire, we are told. But you go deeper into it, and there's a reason to suspect that maybe Menace faked his own death.
Now, why do you say that?
Well, Dellschau never tells us about recovery of a body, never tells us where Menace was buried. Menace himself was also a German immigrant, and there's no info about him returning to Germany, and no one as yet has found a grave in the area. Now, Sonora, is Sonora, California, which is up in Tuolumne County on the western edge of Yosemite National Park. It's in what is called the Gold Country in California, because it was an integral part of the history of the gold rush in this state. And you can find names of people that Dellschau talks about in the cemeteries there locally. I personally found more than one of the family names that Dellschau specifically talks about as being, among the members of the Sonora Aero Club. I found those family names still existing in Sonora, and the towns are Columbia and Jamestown and such. It's a little kind of like a community of small towns. So there's no trace of Peter Menace, but there's also the emergence of a guy named Solomon Andrews, who during the Civil War in the following decade after the Sonora Aero Club, he, according to newspaper reports, there were witnesses to this, he demonstrated a flying machine that he controlled. It was controlled flight. It wasn't, they had balloons back then, of course. They were using them during the war. But this was a triple-hulled, three essentially cigar-shaped fuselages put together with, some type of basket or whatever. The model did not have someone on it. It was smaller than the full size he was going to build, but the idea is that the hanging gondola, so to speak, is where the pilots and the crewmen would be. But
right,
he
the
was
cabin.
yeah, exactly. And he demonstrated this for members of Abraham Lincoln's War Department. Okay. Also, there were local Washington, D.C. newspaper reporters there. This was in 1864, 63 or 4. And we are told that Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, informed Andrews that we're in the middle of a war. We don't have time to fool with this. Thank you, but no thank you. And obviously, when you look at the history of the war, there were no airships swooping down, on the Confederacy, right? But Abraham Lincoln himself was intrigued with this when Andrews had approached him, and that's why he ordered, Stanton to have his representatives at least watch a demonstration of this. I'm pulling a thread on whether Solomon Andrews might have met Peter Menace in the years leading up to the Civil War, leading up to him developing his flying machine. And the reason I suspect that is that you have 30 years after the war, the 1890s airship mystery, okay? And the details reported in that, okay, the things the witnesses claimed they were shown by the airship crews, very human. This has none of this has anything to do with extraterrestrials. Some of the way these airships in the 1890s worked looked like they had an advanced version, perhaps, of what the Sonora Aero Club had been doing 40 years before. Now, the fact that you had Colonel Samuel Tillman, who you can look him up, historical figure, career U.S. Army officer, who was a chemist, he was a cartographer, he was an explorer, the kind of guy that would be involved with, an airship effort, perhaps. He was one of the crewmen on board one of these things and introduced himself, to one of the witnesses. So there is a potential Army connection to the airship mystery of the 1890s. Now, when you go back, you think, okay, we've got some technology that looks like, advancement of the 1850s Sonora Aero Club technology. And then we have this Army connection. And these airship crews are, while they are introducing themselves, while they are showing their airships, there's still this weird kind of secrecy that, to this day, it's just lore that we don't have a solid history. This is a mystery. That's why they have the word mystery in that. So I wonder, okay, was there a U.S. military connection to the airship mystery? So in my mind, it's very possible that what the 1890s airship mystery was 30 years of development of what could possibly have been the United States' first black project. Okay, first black technology project, secret project, developing technology. My hypothesis is that Edward Stanton did not send Solomon Andrews away. On the contrary, what they likely did was, yes, they had a war to focus on. They probably didn't even consider, they probably didn't even consider the possibility of using air power in combat in the war. Because remember, they had a hard time, aviators had a hard time even during World War I convincing militaries that air strikes were the way to go. It took World War II to convince military leaders. So go back to the Civil War. That's why they probably didn't even think about taking advantage of an airship in that way. So my hypothesis is that they probably told Andrews, okay, go back, work on this. And then they picked it up after the war. And, the war was over. The Union had won. Okay, now we can, go look at this thing and see what we can make of it. And this is my black project hypothesis for the airship mystery of the 1890s. And I think that Andrews, somewhere along the way, learned about or might have even met a member of the Sonora Aero Club. Because remember, this was only 10 years later. And those ideas possibly remained through those decades straight into the 1890s airship mystery. And one big fat clue also is that in the Sonora Aero Club, you had a member named Wilson. And in the 1890s airship mystery, you had two, an uncle and a nephew, men named Wilson, who were among the engineers of these things. So when you got a family name, could it have been, could Andrews have known the Wilson of the Sonora Aero Club, and that Wilson was involved with developing his airship, and then on into the 1890s with, I think, government-backed private industry development, just like we do today, right? We have government contractors who develop all our defense technology, our aerospace technology. I think, again, it's very possibly that this airship mystery was the product of the very first time the U.S. government did that. They would have brought in the great minds, industrialists, engineers, and such, and applied whatever it was Andrews and Wilson, because we know there were Wilsons involved in the 1890s mystery, put it all together, and you come out with the 1890s airship mystery. So it's a very interesting saga, and it doesn't even end there with all that I've laid out to suggest. This is a hypothesis. I'm not saying I'm absolutely right about this, but this is my hypothesis. But to add to it, many of your listeners, viewers are familiar with the Nazi bell, right? Die Glocke, the mysterious rotating thing. Well, when you look at Dellschau's drawings, I noticed in his drawings that the motive power device that he describes and draws in his artwork, remember that he died in 1923, so he did all of this. He died a couple of decades before, 15 years before the bell even came into existence. But you find the bell in his drawings, and he claims that this was the device that Peter Menace engineered to make the whole thing work as a flying machine. And it's literally shaped like a bell. It rotates, spins around the central axis, and it It's shaped like a bell, for crying out loud. It can't be anything else. And that's the thing. It predates the alleged legendary Nazi bell by almost 2 decades. Or if he did this in the his drawings, I'm talking about, he's claiming they were doing this in the 1850s. So we're talking 70 years before the bell allegedly happens and is developed. These guys in California, these German immigrants, were pretty much applying a rudimentary proof of concept version of what we know as the bell. And it makes the history of these things a little bit different conversation than most people want to have. A lot of people think that the bell was some type of development from a crashed ET saucer that the Nazis captured, and no, there's more evidence, hypothetical as it is. There is still much more evidence that if the bell existed, and I think it did, some form of it, if it existed, it is much more likely the product of probably a century of exotic technology research leading up to it.
And this aero fuel that's called SUPE, S-U-P-E, this is described very similar to the fuel that's used for the Nazi bell. This kind of liquid metal, probably mercury. With the bell, I believe they said it had a reddish tint, sometimes purplish. So that could have been some sort of crushed precious stones of some sort. And you go back to the Vimanas, and they described it being powered by possibly mercury in some way. So there's this connection that goes back before the arrows and also after the arrows. So there's this lineage that takes you into the future and into the past. That's
right.
Have you read? I'm sure you have Edward Bohr Lytton's "The Coming Race."
Oh yes.
Vero energy.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
It's described as this electrified liquid that powers their aircraft that are very much like arrows. So,
well, you mentioned the precious stones with the red serum of the Nazi bell, and that possibly could be some liquefied rubies are in the mix, and that led me to wonder if somehow liquefied emeralds were among the secret ingredients in Peter Menace's soup. Now, why emeralds? Well, we know emeralds can be found in some abundance down in South America. And look at the German history in South America. I mean, that started in the late 18th century in earnest. Early 19th century, there were Germans all over South America, and they were involved in the early stages of mining down there. Now, the mining really took off by 1871, of course, when the Prussian states had unified into Germany, and they had put their Deutschmark on the gold standard. So they were just all over the place for gold mining, but they were involved with mining before that. And so Peter Menace could easily have had a source of emeralds coming up from South America. And, if rubies could be manipulated in a way to serve as an important element of the serum of the Nazi bell, why couldn't emeralds have been, the secret ingredient in Peter Menace's soup, so to speak? That he even spelled it S-U-P-E, more phonetic than proper.
Well, that's the thing with his drawings, whatever you want to call them, his illustrations. There are a lot of misspellings. Has there been anybody who has went through that and really decoded it? Because it seems like it's encoded that way, purposeful misspellings.
I have I don't have permission to publish them, but I have some privately owned pages of Dellschau's diary. There are many more pages. This particular individual and a few others he's associated with, plus Pete Navarro, who is he's the gentleman who's the reason why we even know about Charles Dellschau, because back in 1971 he found all Dellschau's works, the illustrations and the journals, getting ready to be picked up in the trash. Or no, Fred Washington found them in the trash, took them to his antique and junk shop, and then Pete Navarro found them at Fred Washington's store. So either way, Fred Washington and Pete Navarro saved Dellschau's legacy. And Navarro was the first to attempt decoding the cryptic language that Dellschau probably wrote half of his stuff in. And it hasn't revealed any big overt smoking guns yet, but there are some interesting details in there that are leading to threads that are turning up, are fruitful, and then leading to others that are potentially going to be fruitful for proving that, this was more than just the fantasy of an outsider artist. Just like the 1890s airship mystery, in my opinion, well, not just in my opinion, but on the face of it, if you look at the details for 5 minutes, a lot of critics and skeptics say, oh, it was all just an April Fool's joke. Well, the problem with that April Fool's joke is that the first reported sightings were in the autumn of the year. And there was way too much detail, way too many people involved. And when you look deeper, you find way too many threads for it to all have just been an April Fool's joke done by newspapermen. So I respect my friends and associates who, are lean towards being hardcore skeptics, but the skeptics have to be careful that they don't get religious in their skepticism, which they can be, where they just get to the point where they start writing everything off without really looking at it. And anyway, the Dellschau data, what's published and what hasn't been published, makes this very much a worthy thing to pursue.
Yeah, which him being invited to the Sonora Aero Club to begin with tells you he knows some inside guys, and to be on the inside of such a secret society and to know how to encode these drawings, like this massive library of drawings that are extraordinarily elaborate, where he's basically like William Shakespeare of sketchings of aircraft. And so this tells you that he has inside information, and especially as you've pointed out with his Trump drawings. Would you like to explain those?
Oh, yeah. Well, by the way, Dellschau was sent there by the mysterious NIMSA, the sponsor organization that was based in Berlin. And so he went there to report on their progress, and he ended up getting along with the guys in the Sonora Aero Club so well, and they liked him, that he really just became their friend and was part of rejecting the NIMSA representative when he came out to ask the Sonora Aero Club to make warship arrows, flying machines with weapons on them. And the Sonora Aero Club did not want to do that. But repeat your question again. I'm sorry. wanted to fill that
No,
in.
that's okay. I'm glad you clarified that, because I was overlooking that fact that NIMSA is the one that sent him.
Mhm.
So he was initially a part of NIMSA, because when you look at his story in America, he
Mhm.
seems like this low rent type of dude, this bottom shelf character. He doesn't seem that special. It makes you wonder, how does a not so special guy end up in the
Yeah.
most special secret program?
Exactly. And he was professionally a butcher, worked in a
Right.
butcher shop. Now, I am presently pulling some deeper threads on that, but yeah, absolutely. How did he get selected and recruited by NIMSA to begin with, right? That's an interesting part of the story that really hasn't been told. He entered the United States through Texas. Interestingly enough, you find out that not everybody came through Ellis Island in New York. He came up through the Gulf and entered via Texas. And after his time out here in California in Sonora, he returned to Texas, and that's where he lived the rest of his life, and was a butcher and was married. But yeah, we don't know anything so far, because remember, his diaries are still being studied and decoded um, to this day. So there might very well be something in there. But I agree with you. He had to have been a guy who had his mind on things other than just, prime cuts of beef. He had to have known some things, had to have had at least some level of comprehension to be, in my opinion, to be even recruited by NIMSA to go be their representative. So yeah, that is an interesting, untold so far part of the story.
And what I was referring to earlier, the Trump illustrations.
Yes.
Would you like to explain those?
Yeah, it's interesting. The arrows, remember that's spelled AERO for those listening. Um, they the members of the Sonora Aero Club would present their designs. Dellschau says some were built, many were not. And one of the designs was called, and they would give little names to these things, and one of them was called the Aero Trump. Like they would, like a guy named George Newell, his was called the Aero Newell, and there was the Aero this, the Aero that, but there was the Aero Trump. Now, there wasn't anyone on the roster that Dellschau provides of the names he mentions named Trump. And as far as Donald Trump's earliest ancestor in the U.S., that the understanding is, what we know is that he came later in the 19th century, but that doesn't mean there could not have been a Trump in the club. However, the ship is not named after anyone. It's more of like a trump card, right? So to speak. And what's very interesting is the number in the drawing that Dellschau assigns to it. Remember, Dellschau died in 1923, but his drawings of the Aero Trump, Trump, with the word Trump emblazoned on the side of the actual craft, is number 4,500. The obvious there, Donald Trump became the 45th president, almost 100 years after Dellschau dies.
And numerologically, the zeros are mute, so you can
Yes.
basically erase those. So it's
Yeah. So
45.
it's Trump 45. This is a fact in Dellschau stuff. No matter where you sit politically, it's just, what do you do with that? It's there. It was drawn sometime between 1898 and 1923. So it's one of those weird things. And if you wanted to get really skeptical, it still had to have been drawn before 1971, when Pete Navarro and Fred Washington found these things. So still, this Aero Trump number 45 predates, you know, our present history, and a president with that name who's that number.
And it aligns with Ingersoll Lockwood's books. He had one in 1900, I believe it was, that was The Last President. And that's still a possibility because he's running again. And then there was another one, Baron von Trump's Underground.
The Adventures, yeah.
Something.
The Underground Adventures, yeah.
Yeah, so that ties back again to this whole underground ancient civilization type of thing, the whole Hollow Earth.
Yeah. I wrote a book with a guy named Todd Wood about Ingersoll Lockwood. It's titled The Ingersoll Lockwood Mystery. And in that, we analyzed the Lockwood books. Now, we point out the little precog details that seem to resonate with Donald Trump's life, and you find more of those in the Baron Trump adventure stories. Now, interestingly enough, Lockwood's story novella, The Last President, actually doesn't have anything to do with Trump at all. When you
read where he lived.
Yeah, there's
Fifth Avenue where Trump
there's
ended up
one
buying.
site. There's one site where there's rioters show up on the Fifth Avenue address. Yeah. Other than that,
right,
the story The Last President has to do with the Democrat who's in office. So you read the story, it's there, and even that Democrat has a last name that begins with B. It's William Jennings Bryan. And the things that are described in that story are eerily spot on with stuff that went on right before and through 2020, and also what has continued into the first 2 years of Biden's time in office. But The Last President, when you read the story, The Last President is that Democrat president, because when you read the story, you learn what happens to him, what happens to the country as a result of all that. And it's just, it's a wild ride when you think about our recent history. But what's interesting is it has nothing to do with Trump, whereas the Baron Trump ones have, resonance all over the place. And Todd and I go into, again, set the politics of it aside, we go into how in the heck did Lockwood write these stories that were so prescient specifically to our times right now. And we get into how weird that is. And yeah, and then on top of that, you have Dellschau with this Trump 45 flying machine. And then subsequent to that, in between the rise of Donald Trump and Dellschau's passing, you have John Trump, Trump's uncle, who, as many know, was the guy that the FBI asked to go look at the Nikola Tesla papers the day Tesla died, because John Trump was such a respected electrical engineer, the kind of guy that was into these exotic technologies. So, it's just, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's there that you have to wonder what's going on, and that's one of the things I try to do is try to find where there are connections. If I don't find any, I admit that. I say, well, I haven't found it here, I haven't found it there, or if I find that that when you look closer, the facts clarify something more, I present the clarification. But so far, it is one big fat mystery as to how all of this happened the way it did.
Speaking of Tesla, he once announced that he was going to create some sort of airship that he explained that wouldn't be identifiable to them because it wouldn't have wings. It wouldn't look like any, aircraft of that day that you could identify in any way whatsoever. So how far do you think he got with that?
Oh, that's a really enticing question. Tim Schwartz and a guy named Sean Castile wrote a book with Tim Schwartz titled "Did Tesla Go to Mars?" And in that book, they talk about a rumor that Tesla was asked by this secretive group, wealthy, to design an airship that they could have constructed that they could go out into space and go to Mars in. Okay, now this was in 1903 is when this allegedly happened. And my understanding is that the late Jim Keith, a great researcher and well known for the conspiracy theory, legitimate conspiracy theory work that he had done. My understanding is that he received this information, rumored information, via a source who sent it to him in an email, and then he shared it with Tim Schwartz. And there are those who think that there's a guy I know, John Batista. He lives in Texas, and he suggested that the radio signals that Tesla talked about having received in the 1920s, would he believe they came from Mars? Well, John asks, could that have been communication from the people who asked him to build the airship? Could they have made it to Mars and found, a way to live there, survive there, maybe in one of the underground city, whatever? And anyway, could this have been some type of communication from them to Tesla? And I thought, that's an intriguing question. I've never heard anybody, ask that before. So it's based on complete rumor. It's thin. The evidence for it is thin. But in light of the airship mystery that went on in the 1890s, the Sonora Aero Club stuff, what appears to be the pursuit of exotic technologies throughout the 19th century, and the existence of Oliver Heaviside, who came up with gravito-electromagnetism, GEM, in 1893. And under his theory, if you use this gravito-electromagnetism, you could generate a force field around an object. This force field, according to Heaviside in 1893, I say again, this force field could also protect the object from the effects of G forces. So in 1893, you got Oliver Heaviside publishing that idea, that theory. And you have, we're told in 1903, 10 years later, the rumor that Tesla was asked to do this. And you're wondering, how in the heck could anybody fly a Tesla airship out in space? Well, gosh, if you apply Heaviside's GEM, gravito-electromagnetics, to the Tesla airship, you might have life support system, is the point. You might be able to power and sustain a life support system on this airship. So, it's left for, you to decide for yourself, is there anything to it? I pull the threads whenever I find them and see them and document what I find. And I know what I'd like to think is possible. And I think it would be totally cool if somebody actually flew an airship in 1903, to Mars. That would be like a Ray Harryhausen movie, right? The First Men on the Moon. It would just be really, really cool. There's so many reasons to argue why it's not likely, that both scientific and historical, because if someone did do that, my gosh, it's been 119 years. Why haven't we heard about this? Where are they? What's going on? But then somebody argued, well, maybe they're one of the breakaways. And I have postulated that in my works, that I think that going back to the Civil War and the Solomon Andrews airship, I think the idea that this hypothetical first black technology project of the United States produced 30 years later what people were seeing in the 1890s. What if it was that group who came to Tesla in 1903, or members of that project who broke off from that to do an independent project? Okay, and maybe what if they were the ones who went to Tesla in 1903, and therefore they had all this 30 years of knowledge of developing these airships, but they wanted to bring Tesla in on it and, apply what Heaviside had published and put forth to actually go into space. And maybe they were a true breakaway, I propose. And being a breakaway, that's why we wouldn't have heard from them, because they truly broke away, don't care to have anything to do with us, off doing their own thing. Remember, we the common people, we don't know, because we don't work for NASA, we don't work for Space Force. We don't know really who and what's up there to be encountered. Our community's full of books and documentaries and that discussion, right, as to what's up there. So it's a very intriguing subject that I love to look at and hypothesize on. But presently there's more to say that there's more against it than there is for it. But that doesn't stop me from researching things and investigating things.
Well, following the Tesla trail, if you look at Otis T. Carr, that kind of backs it up, corroborates it, and if you believe that what he proposed is true, then
right,
that's some real hardcore evidence. But when it comes to black projects and secret projects, you're not going to get hardcore evidence.
right.
So we have Artemis going on right now. What do you think of these NASA programs, these rockets? Because like you've shown, we've had these anti-gravity machines since the 1850s. So why are we still blasting ourselves off into outer space like absolute baboons?
Well, I think that some people have been seriously working on anti-gravity since the mid 19th century. Yeah, I'll go that far. And we know that in American aerospace journals, aviation journals, and scientific journals, there were open source articles being written about anti-gravity research up through the 50s. And then suddenly, I think in 1958, boom, it just, the curtain came down and it was not spoken of again. Now, others think that that's because some serious breakthrough was made and they realized, whoa, okay, this is a real thing. And so I argue that you can, at the very least, argue that since 1958, somebody's been making advances in anti-gravity technology and propulsion. So yes, I think rockets, the rockets as we have known them are kind of a quaint form, right? I mean, you're dealing with fuel and it costs so much, but just like anything, look at the combustion engine over the course of a century. It started as a kind of a jalopy, kind of loud, shaky thing, and look at the whatever the top engines are, like a Ferrari race engine today. They're just smooth and everything. So certainly, yes, rocket technology itself has advanced greatly since the late 60s, since the Apollo era and such. But still, you'd think, wait a minute, if there was workable, practical anti-gravity, why are these guys still using rockets? Certainly, for instance, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos would have enough insider clout to pursue that line. Isn't it interesting that these two very, very wealthy men, both pursuing space, I would say Musk, more enthusiastically, isn't it interesting that they are using rocket technology in 2022? Is anti-gravity off limits? Have they been told you won't go there? Because I think a couple of guys like that could certainly get their hands on aspects of that technology, or at least hire the people who could develop it, their own line of anti-gravity, so to speak. Let's call it alternative propulsion to rockets. And why haven't they? Maybe they are working on it and they just haven't introduced it. But it's interesting that that they are working with rockets. Now, I will say this: being a graybeard, growing up in a certain generation, I thought it was really cool when we saw Musk's rocket that, lifts off and then lands, on its feet, and then take it, just like in the old science fiction movies, right? Landing on that column of fire. And that was just cool, particularly for someone in my generation or older, because it was, again, just like something out of Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers, you name it. But I find it interesting that we are seeing rockets still being used. And could you say that maybe the United States, having gotten out of rocket building, right? Could that have been a suggestion that the writing was on the wall and we've been pursuing other things? But then the problem is, sure, we were using I think the Russians and other countries' rockets to put our NASA astronauts in space, but is our classified space ops, are they using something else? Have they been using something else? And then, you're right, the Artemis stuff, off the top of my head, I don't know who's building the Artemis for us. Do you know the aerospace company that's...
Oh, no, I haven't looked into it that much.
Yeah, I haven't looked too deeply. I think our return to the moon, definitely has upfront everything to do with strategic, because now that you have the Chinese up there, and I think India, right? India or Japan put landers up there. I think now we're kind of like, okay, now we overtly have to go back to the moon, because I think we've been using access to the moon in the intervening years, just on a classified level. Me, I'm not an advocate of this fantastical SSP, secret space program, that these clowns, were talking about for 5 or 6 years there, about time jumping, space coming. That's nonsense. But I do think that there absolutely has been a classified manned space program being conducted by the United States since the 50s, the 1950s, mostly running parallel to what the public knew, from NASA. But then I think that somewhere in the late 1970s, the classified program technology started pulling a little bit faster ahead of the known space technology. And that's when things really took off, so to speak. It's my opinion that the new Space Force, which people were joking about and laughing about when it first came out, folks, it was inevitable. We were inevitably going to have some space branch of our military. But I think the history of our classified space ops we're just folded into what is now the classified history of Space Force. So
do you believe in the possibility of secret military bases on the moon, or any colonization?
Not colonization, but if I would say it would be more of an outpost presence. It wouldn't be, people tend to, this is why I use the word breakaway, prefer to use the phrase breakaway group now instead of breakaway civilization, because civilization is too big of a word, whereas group is more fitting. So yes, to answer your question, I do think that we have had some type of literal presence on the moon in the intervening years, at the very least, if not constant. We're capable of putting people, up on the moon, but for extended periods of time. But I think it would be kind of like an outpost thing, maybe minimum 2 personnel, at the most maybe 4 or 5, that kind of thing. Because you're, the life support, the and all that goes with that, that's particularly if you were putting things up there with rockets. Now, if you have an alternative form of lift and propulsion and space travel, that suddenly makes the expense, think about this, that suddenly makes the expense of having people stationed in space a lot less, because you're not putting the gazillions of dollars into rocket fuel and rockets that you can't reuse, craft you can't reuse and stuff, right? So, there's another possible argument for some alternative means of space flight because of the question, do we have people stationed, for example, on the moon? I personally suspect, and I put it this way, I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if we were to, find out down the road that we've actually put boots on Mars, so to speak, or at least we've tried it once. You could argue that there's all this weirdness about Apollo 11. There was, Neil Armstrong comes back and he's an aw shucks guy for the rest of his life. If he and Aldrin were truly, and I'm not taking away anything that they did. I mean, it's spectacular every time it's done, even if it's done 100 times. But we're in the middle of a Cold War, right? So allegedly, and we're putting on this dog and pony show for the world, and we've never actually done it to know that we can do it and that it works. We've come close, we're told. I hypothesize, I have suggested this for years, that there was a classified mission where they actually tested that lander and knew that it would work before Apollo 11. That doesn't mean that it wasn't dangerous each time an Apollo mission went up there. What I'm saying is the way we do things, and I say particularly then, we weren't going to put on a big show to the world and without knowing at all that it could be done, because the potential for embarrassment, and in those days, that was a big deal, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if we found out that, and we never will, we found out that there was a secret mission to make sure that lander could work. And that's why Armstrong was so kind of humble about being the first man on the moon. I argue, this is my hypothesis, is that, naturally, if you weren't, you wouldn't want to go to a parade every year. You wouldn't want people constantly reminding you of that. And there's enough weirdness that the astronauts have expressed since those missions that, it makes you wonder exactly what the heck. So
the obvious argument that can be made is that they were willing to put a show on for the world because it was literally a show, all theatrics, staged event. And I subscribe to that because there's so much evidence that really makes it highly questionable. And I would say that being in a space race, you want to make sure everything is perfect to be publicized. So
yeah.
Why wouldn't you go to a studio? Why wouldn't you hire a Kubrick?
Well, no,
and I think that NASA is a smokescreen organization. I think that they are a money funneler, and I think that they're more of a surveillance company than anything. They're one letter away from being NSA, for God's sake.
Well, they are. A lot of people don't know this, but they are a Defense Department charter organization. They are primarily NASA. from my perspective, we went to the moon. Apollo 11 went to the moon. I just propose the possibility that Apollo 11 wasn't the first time we actually landed because of the reasons you pointed out. We wanted to make sure that it could work. Remember, those guys,
I just want to be clear. I believe we made it to the moon. I don't think NASA ever tried to go to the moon because I think it's much cheaper to put out these fronts and then harvest the money that way, while there are secret programs that are going back and forth to the moon much easier than what you can do publicly.
I don't know. I'll have to disagree with you there. I think those NASA missions we saw actually went to the moon and landed. I just don't think that 11 was the first one. I think they did it classified first to make sure it could work. Each mission is dangerous, of course. Each mission is a risk. It's a spectacular achievement, but that's what I think. I'm convinced that we went, but I do agree there's secrets kept from us. I think they found things up there and saw things up there that we are not told, and to this day we're still not told. I do agree that they doctor imagery. I think they do the same with Mars. The data, coming from Mars. So again, just like what I think about the moon with Mars, why not try it first? Go see if your system works, see if they can make it there and back alive, see what you're going to find there once you get on the ground, right? Before you do the big dog and pony show, like, oh, gee, look, first Mars landing. I'm not buying that, that part of it. But I think we do actually go and have gone out there for decades. But as far as presence on the moon, I don't have a problem with the idea that we have had at one time or another outposts for whatever reason. So
we haven't discussed anything extraterrestrial thus far, so I'd like to bring that in because sure. I think, quite obviously, most encounters can be explained away with military craft or MK Ultra, these kind of things, or even corporate craft that's being shot up into space.
Sure.
But I think there still is a portion, maybe a fraction of a portion, that is truly extraterrestrial. And I think that Roswell shows you how the military, or I should say our government, can use something like that to hide it whichever way they want to go. If it is extraterrestrial and they want you to believe that it's military craft, they can smudge it that way. If it is human and they want to cover it up, they'll just make it look extraterrestrial and get people questioning that way. So they can smudge it both ways.
Which is what I think they did, the latter one. I think it was a classified flight that they put the veneer of ET on, and they've continued to encourage that. That's what I think on that. But you bring up a good point. I like to say this. I think that 90% of all legitimate UFO sighting reports, okay, not the ones where people are just making it up so they can be one of the cool kids and be part of the fun, legitimate, where somebody actually saw something they couldn't explain. I think 90% of that can be explained by classified technology being used or developed, either by the military or the aerospace industry, that kind of thing. Now that leaves 10%, which cannot be explained by human technology. So in that 10%, you would have all sorts of other possibilities, not just ET. You have other weird phenomena, this, that, or the other. But look at it this way. Let's say it was a fraction of that 10%. Well, if you had, I think MUFON and other organizations a few years ago, when I presented this idea, they had reported that there were, in a given month of 2019, there were 5,000 UFO, seemingly legitimate UFO reports around the world. Okay. That's 5,000 around the world in one given month. Okay. Now, under my idea, only 90% of those could be explained by classified human technology. So what does that leave you with? That leaves you with 500. Okay. Now, let's say only 10% of those could be extraterrestrial. Okay. That leaves 50 potential ET craft in one given month. It only takes one. So when I throw out my 90% number, the initial reaction I get from folks is, "Oh God!" But I go through all that and I point out to them, see, in a given month there were 5,000 sightings in 2019 in this one period of a month, and under my formula, 50 of those 5,000 could have been ETs, and that would be, again, the word spectacular. I mean, my God, if there were 50 ET UFOs seen in one given month, that's a lot. Again, because it only takes one. And I certainly think they're out there. I absolutely think extraterrestrials exist. To me, it's kind of a no-brainer to assume that, out there are other intelligent worlds with advanced technology. And I think we have off and on been encountering them, and we are certainly due for a major open encounter with them eventually. And I just don't think that so many of the UFO reports are explained by extraterrestrials. That's where I come from on that.
But is it possible that, say, NIMSA acquired their knowledge of this special fuel, this anti-gravity power, or this link to anti-gravity power through some sort of ancient craft that possibly came from extraterrestrials, or maybe an ancient civilization of humans that was much more advanced than what we know today?
I think that's more likely. I think it's more likely that they got their hands on, in groups like them, somebody has got their hands on what I call the lost technologies of the forgotten civilizations. I think there's very much something to that. But at the same time, in this same evidence, if we'll call it that points to the modern enthusiasts getting their hands on this ancient human technology, at the same time, in that evidence, okay, you find reference to people who came from other worlds. So ultimately, yeah, I think there was some type of extraterrestrial influence in the development of those technologies, but it's ancient. It's way within this hypothesis, it would be way in the distant past, not some recent, the whole crashed saucer meme. If you listen to these people, saucers are crashing all over the place. The technology of the ETs must really suck, because wow, they get to Earth and they're just crashing all over the place. So that's just a big fantasy that there's really little to zero, mostly zero, to back it up. Not that it hasn't happened. I'm not saying for sure that I know that it hasn't happened, but it's not as likely as is popularly believed. And there's actually more evidence for the pursuit of lost human technologies through,
I said crashed when I definitely shouldn't have said crashed, because that goes against everything I think logically. As you said, you're going to figure out technology to transcend space and time, thousands of light years, dealing with all this space debris. but yet you get to Earth and you never figured that out. Just boom, or
Yeah.
maybe
Right.
you celebrate, you crack open a few beers and get a little too intoxicated for your
Yeah.
own good.
Now, sharing technology, yeah, right there. That's what I think happened in the ancient times is
Mm.
someone came from another world and brought us, the humans that were here up to a certain, higher level. I mean, we have these legends and stories of Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha and the Tuatha and these other mysterious people who come from some unknown world and teach the locals, technologies and advance their civilization, here. So yeah, I think it's more likely something like that, than crash retrievals.
So when we look at Werner von Braun and some of the things he said, especially the predictions he made about some of the threats that we would encounter in the future that have come true. I mean, he even predicted an Elon going to Mars.
Yeah.
And most of the things he mentioned came true, like with the terrorists. And I think what we have left in that list is what, asteroids, and then a
faked ET invasion.
right. So do you see a Project Bluebeam in our future?
Yeah, why not? Here's an irony though that I'd like to point out. I think that if, number one, we have one source that Werner von Braun said these things, okay, one source, and she didn't reveal this publicly until we were well into the 1990s. So when you think about that, 3 of those 5 things had already come to pass or were in the process of coming to pass. Okay, and the other 2, at least one, the asteroid thing, had been talked about because there were already a couple of movies made about it in '99. So it just to be devil's advocate, is the one source telling us a true story? Did she get it accurate? And also the irony is that if he did say these things, what if she misinterpreted or is reinterpreting what he said about the last one? Remember what she said, what the source said about what von Braun told her was that the 5th one would be an alien threat, an ET threat. Okay. And he said that he was saying that this would be used to establish a tyranny over us, right? To control us. That's what the object of all these 5 things were. Now, and he said it would be a lie. Okay. Well, are we so sure that he said that an ET threat from space is a lie, or was he saying that the use of that against, the people on Earth was the lie? Look at it this way. Weapons of mass destruction are a very real thing, aren't they? They're a real thing in our world. They are a threat. They are very dangerous. Okay. Weapons of mass destruction being in Iraq to get everybody to go along with a war, that appears to have been a lie. So the weapons of mass destruction is real, but the use of that for political aims was, where the lie comes in. Apply that to what von Braun said about the ETs, because I'll tell you right now, all these people out there that are preaching that the ETs are all peaceful, there's no threat from space. Von Braun said so. No, he did not. What von Braun said, according to the source, his own words, what von Braun said was that the ET threat would be used against, the public. Okay. I want you to think about it. The cosmos is vast. If other intelligent civilizations, advanced technological civilizations are out there, are you telling me that the only warlike civilization exists on our little planet and that nowhere in the cosmos is there going to be a belligerent conquest-minded civilization that just means our destruction. Come on, that I tell people that's childish to think that. And I don't care who channeled what, or who saw a vision or remote viewed this through the Ouija. That's all nonsense. When you're talking about this, we are going to encounter a belligerent civilization out there. There are going to be threats out there. And here's the thing, they might already be aware of one. And here's where the lie comes in. This is where we got to be careful. The threat itself could be a real, very real potential threat. And it's that threat that they will use to spin everybody up and tell us we need to go along with all these things we don't really need to do. Or they will use that threat to scare us into just accepting a tyranny. That, I think, is what von Braun was warning us about. And the irony is there may very well be a threatening civilization out there. And some scholars beyond me say that there's reason to suspect that they're on their way. And so we're between a rock and a hard place.
Why do they suspect they're on their way? What led them to believe that?
Well, when they look at for instance, when you look at the ancient texts that talk about beings coming from other worlds and making war here, Joseph Farrell points out that the Old Testament Yahweh, there's research that points out that Yahweh is not a proper name, an individual's proper name, like Joe, Fred, Jesus, or Marduk, or whatever. Yahweh is a title. And when you look at some of the behaviors of the Yahweh, he doesn't seem like this almighty, all-loving God that then, in that particular tradition that, Christ talks about. This guy in the Old Testament seems like a homicidal maniac, right? And then when you look at the syncretic stories in, I think, the Popol Vuh, they talk about the same figure who's been determined to be syncretically the same figure as the Yahweh. They talk about them having a really creepy reaction to the flesh of the animals being prepared for them, and that they are just these really creepy beings that come from space and have this advanced technology. You have traditions like that. You have whatever people think of Richard Hoagland, there is a part of his research where he talks about the mystical side and the symbolism of, for example, the Apollo program. And there he points out some very intriguing reasons. It's all within the details of his book. I think it's Dark Mission. He points out that there's very intriguing reasons to suspect that in the Apollo mission, where we landed, how we did it, the dates, when we landed, where we went, the plaque we left behind, and all this other stuff, is that we're communicating to someone out there. That, yeah, we're communicating in a way that supplicants do, like we're here, we're coming in peace. We're going out here for peaceful reasons. Or I think I'm trying to remember who it is. Joseph Farrell's a friend of mine. That's why I mention him a lot. But he talks about another scholar that points out, John Brandenburg, I think, might be in on this thing too, that I've lost my point there. There's so many points. Brandenburg, of course, talks about that he found isotopal evidence on Mars of a nuclear strike, and other scientists backed him up and said, yeah, that's what it appears to be. So we have all this cosmic war stuff in the past, in our lore, and now in scientific evidence. So who is it that is out there. Oh, now I remember my point. The idea that maybe we had been involved, or someone here on Earth had been at fault in some type of cosmic conflict that resulted in one planet being obliterated, and it's now the asteroid belt, and maybe we truly are sequestered to this planet. And maybe that's why when we finally rebuild our technology to the point where we can get to the moon, we make sure that, oh, we're just doing this in peace. We're not doing this to, be warlike again. It's just an idea that's out there. I don't know where I stand on that yet or not. It's an intriguing idea. So, I have no problem with the possibility that someone's out there and they're expecting them. Case in point, the thing that I should say that first made me wonder about this was years ago, the late 80s, I got to tour through an in-law at the time. I got to tour an aircraft called the Kuiper Aerial Observatory. It was ostensibly under NASA. All the flight crew were wearing military flight suits, not NASA flight suits, but that's beside the point. And this in-law was a astronomical scientist involved with the aircraft, and they had, according to what he told me, they had a mission. Their entire mission, their focus was one part of the sky that one time a year they would fly down there for however many months. And that was the part of the sky that they were supposed to focus on and study. And that was their whole entire mission. Now, where they would fly down to was New Zealand. Okay. And the Kuiper Flying Observatory, Aerial Observatory, would, with the telescopes on board back then, study a part of the sky that can only be seen down there. Now, think about how close that is to Antarctica also. Now, what's interesting is that was in the late 80s. I learned that and got to go on the aircraft and everything. In recent years, there have been rumors and people telling stories about intelligent extraterrestrials possibly coming from that same part of the sky. And, I thought, why would they have studied just that one part of the sky? Why were there people, apparently military crewmen that were serving as the flight crew of this NASA, peaceful science thing? It makes you wonder. It makes you wonder what we know about who's out there, and the possibility is someone on their way, someone who we need to be worried about. And is this what von Braun was saying they were going to use to scare us into some type of tyranny? Again, not that the threat isn't real. It's what, the government, so to speak, the leaders do with that threat to frighten us into giving up, control to them. That's where I'm at on that.
So, full disclosure, you did work as a female body inspector for 6 years.
I worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Right. So
for 6 years.
Do you have anything you want to whistle blow on exclusively here on Shooting 101?
I'll tell you right now, I am disgusted and deeply disappointed in what that organization has become. When I worked for them, no organization, certainly not that one, is without its problems, obviously. But wow, I never saw or would have imagined back then anything like we're seeing publicly. And my inside sources, I still have insiders, and they are just as disgusted and disappointed with the leadership of the organization. It's just, for the first time in my life, adult life, I'm almost embarrassed to, I'm reluctant to get into discussing that, yeah, I worked for the FBI. And that's sad, because I've always been proud of that. That was, something I was proud of and still am on my resume. I went to the Air Force after that, got my commission, and went right into being a special agent for OSI. and proud of that too. And then did some counterterrorism with some other guys for the years after getting out of the Air Force. So I've had the benefit of seeing multiple agencies from the inside, and I never would imagine the FBI doing what they're doing and being what they are now. It's scary times.
Right. So I'm going to let you wrap this up however you'd like to wrap it up. Everything we've discussed, whatever message you want to send out to the fine folks out there in podcast land.
Well, I just, again, thank you for having me on again. And I enjoy talking with you, and I hope your audience finds all this stuff interesting. I am, presently immersed in my in my secret missions series. I'm working on the follow-up to my Napoleon book, but also I've got some media development going on, which I can't talk about too much right now, but I might have kind of an exciting announcement fairly soon. I just, when you look at all this stuff, try to look at it from different perspectives than the popular one, because even as I said with my 90% versus 10% on UFOs being, classified human tech, remember that remaining 10% still affords a lot of potential, ET sightings. So going against or considering the possibilities other than the popular notions on any of these kinds of topics doesn't mean that you're completely dismissing the popular possibility. It just means you're being more realistic and grounded in how you look at it and pursue the evidence for it. And what that does ultimately is it leads you to better evidence and better cases and more substantial experiences. So, just that's all I would throw out there. Just let yourself use a little more critical thinking than maybe feels comfortable, but it will pay off. I have a live stream every Sunday night at the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube, and now it's at Odyssey as well. And my books, I sell them only print on demand. I'm a small press guy. Amazon is not good for small press guys, so I sell them at lostconlibrary.com. You'll find my book sales page there, and that's about it. Thanks again for having me.
Oh, this has been great. This has been a really cool conversation. One of my most interesting, and my wheels are definitely turning. And I have about 1 billion more questions to ask you, so hopefully you'll come back on one of these days.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, you take care, Walter.
All right, you too.
As a matter of fact, the matter of fact is immaterial. Despite one's best efforts to present it as a palpable, tangible object, if its receiver rejects it as some gaseous mist, it remains the ether of fact. No matter how much evidence, proof, and logic makes up its composition, if a mind refuses to confirm its legitimacy, to them it becomes the ether of fiction. Their book of reality is based on a true illusion. So how can a locked fortress of mind be opened? How can light be shown through stitched eyelids? How can you materialize fact in the wonderland of a deceived psyche? Perception is a stubborn mule. It must be coaxed. It must be prodded. It must be given incentive. Most of all, it must feel safe in its transition from secure familiarity to the bewildering, baffling, dizzying unknown. The exchange of unpopular truths is a matter of tact, conversation, friendly debate, heartfelt honesty with the agreeance of disagreement. Above all, remember this, my friends. It is open ears that open minds. Love, peace, happiness. Signing off. Deuces.